So my name's Ralph Ellis. Council training misinformation, which is going on right now. But I think this is so badly taught that it's not misinformation. It is disinformation. It's pretty much propaganda, basically. So let's have a look at this. What are we talking about? We're talking about the carbon literacy project, which Sandi was talking about just a minute ago. But that's not very literate, because it's really carbon dioxide literacy project, nothing to do with carbon. Anyway, this is them. Let me have a look at my pointer here. So it's carbon literacy for parish and town councils and others besides. And they get a qualification, inverted commas. Help to tackle the climate emergency. They've already presupposed we've got an emergency here. So who are they? Carbon Literacy Trust is a private charity, so it's not actually the council doing this. It's not even the government. They have contracted in this charity to inform the public, well, sort of inform, about the climate. Yeah, okay. Now, they have an income of $640,000 a year, 103,000 of which comes from government. And they have a training programme for Manchester Council, National Health Service, Manchester Museum, Children's BBC, Manchester University, and Coronation Street. Coronation Street apparently is the most woke programme on the television because all of their producers have been infected by the carbon dioxide literary project. Trouble is, none of this is written by climate scientists. It's based on random internet searches. And so I would contend that pretty much everything they're doing in this training is actually incorrect. Now, we don't have much time. Yes, so what does Ralph Ellis know that they don't? Well, this is my last climate paper that I wrote, which is modulation of ice ages by precession and dust albedo feedbacks. So I do know a little bit about climate. And it's a little bit controversial because it says the feedback agent is dust albedo, not CO2. So a very successful paper, had 45,000 downloads so far, and rather controversial. But we're not going to talk about this, although we will look at one graph from this paper. Here it is. So this is 800,000 years of data from the Antarctic, and we've got temperature in red, CO2 in blue, and they are in lockstep together. These are all the major ice ages over the last 800,000 years. And some people have presumed from this that CO2 is controlling temperature. But of course, correlation does not imply causation. You need a rationale. And we could look at this graph, this very same graph, in a different fashion. We could say that every time CO2 is high, the world cools. And every time CO2 is low, the world warms. So we could say that high CO2 causes cooling and low CO2 causes warming. Now, it's more complex than that, but I think you can see from this that there are other factors involved in temperature control on this planet, because this would not happen if CO2 was a very strong greenhouse gas. Moving along, how did this all start? It started with hiding the decline, which Sandi's already talked about. This is a graph of 1,000 years of climate data taken from tree rings, which are not a very good proxy for weather. 1,000 years of data, and you can see the temperature there rolls along for about 950 years until we get to the mid-20th century when the temperature rockets up. So how did they come across this particular graph? Well, we can see that from the, this is one of the ClimateGate emails, and it says here, I've just completed Mike's nature trick. Mike is Professor Michael Mann. Nature is the scientific journal Nature. I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each of the series for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards, and from 1961 for Keith Briffa's data, to hide the decline. So what decline were they hiding? Well, we can see that from Keith Briffa's data. Again, this is tree ring data over 600 years, and you can see the temperature rolls along for 600 years until it gets to the mid-20th century, and then the temperature declines. So the temperature went down in the 20th century. It didn't go up, it went down. This is known as the divergence problem, and the divergence problem says that tree rings record temperature accurately for hundreds of years until 1950, and then they stop. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. So what do you do if you've got a divergence problem? So you cut off the end of the graph and you stitch in the thermometer data, and now you've got yourself a hockey stick. And that's how the hockey stick graph was created, and I call that disinformation because it's not real. And that's why when you look at the hockey stick graph, it has a different colour on the end of it, because it's a stitch between two different data sets. It's a stitch up, basically. So anyway, that is how this whole climate scare was started. And now we come on to the before we get onto the training programme, we've got the BBC weather maps. You've all seen this, so I'll run through this. Which is the warmer? Yeah, the one on the left-hand side, of course. Why did they change it? Well, the BBC said it was to make the maps easier to read. Yeah, don't believe that one at all. Tornado numbers, I know we've been through some of this in my previous talk, but anyway, we'll quickly run through this. What's happening to tornadoes? Well, we all know they're getting worse, they're getting stronger. The towns and communities are being wiped out all over America. So let's look at the data. This data comes from NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Authority in America. And they've got 70 years of data here, and as you can see, our numbers of strong tornadoes have been decreasing for 70 years. So where is the climate alarmism in that data? Yeah, doesn't exist, does it? Same happens with tropical cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, etc. We all know what's happening with them. They're getting worse, and coastal communities are being wiped out all over the world. Well, let's look at the data. This is from Dr. Ryan Mao. This is the satellite data over the last 40 years. And as you can see, all hurricanes on the top have been slightly reducing over 40 years. Major hurricanes down below, and they have been steady for 40 years, no change. Interesting, isn't it? Where's the climate alarmism in that data? We can take this back further because there is proxy data we can use, which takes us back even further. This is from Chand et al., 2022, so this is quite a recent paper, this one. It was in Nature. Anyway, the number of tropical cyclones increased from 1850, and then they have been decreasing for 120 years. Where is the climate emergency in that data? They're making it up, basically, as they go along. Polar bears, we can't leave this without the polar bear data because they are the canary in the coal mine for the climate industry. So what's happening to polar bears? Well, we all know they're being wiped out, basically. They will be extinct in 20 years, according to the BBC. So let's look at the data. This is from Dr. Susan Crockford, and this is 60 years of data, which is not bad. And as you can see, polar bear numbers have been increasing for 60 years. Not only increasing, they've quadrupled in 60 years. Again, where is the climate alarmism in this data? It's not real, is it? Most of this is not real. So CO2 concentrations. Now we get to the training. So this is from the training manual for all councils. This is going out from the Climate Carbon Literacy Trust, as they call themselves. Level of CO2 over the past 800,000 years. And this is correct. This is a true graph. So it's very much the same as the first one I showed you. This is all of the major ice ages over the last 800,000 years. Now, what they're trying to highlight here is that recent CO2 concentrations have increased dramatically, which they have. This is true. And so they're trying, but what they won't tell you is this. So this is CO2 over millions of years. This is from Siverman et al., 2015. So the black line is the CO2 line. The blue line is temperature. And as you can see, there's not a lot of correlation between temperature and CO2. So this is us here, 0, going back 600 million years. Now, the thing is, of course, that during the Jurassic era, as Sandi was saying before, CO2 was 2,500 parts per million, which is 6 times higher than now. So they're highlighting the increase in CO2 recently, but they're not highlighting the fact that during the Jurassic era, CO2 was much higher. And the biosphere was fine. In fact, you could say that the large size of dinosaurs was in part due to extra CO2. More CO2 equals bigger plants, equals bigger herbivores, equals bigger carnivores. The other thing they won't tell you with this graph from the training material is that is the death zone. Below that line, all life on Earth will die. And you can see that we got very close to it during the peaks of the ice ages when CO2 reduced. Below this line, all of the plants start dying off. And if all the plants die, all the animals die. And all life on Earth will end. They don't tell you about that. So extra CO2 gives us a much better buffer to the death zone. It's good for the environment if they care about the environment. So CO2 is plant food. I'm sure you all know that. So CO2 is the most important gas in the atmosphere. Councils are restricting the very stuff of life if they go ahead with these projects. And increasing CO2 is actually greening the planet. There has been quite a few papers out recently on the extra productivity of the biosphere. Something like 15% of our agricultural production is because of extra CO2 in the atmosphere, because it's plant food. Moving on, what do they say here? This is a quick briefing about what CO2 does. So what's the difference between these plants? Well, CO2, of course. Those on the left have lots of CO2, those on the right do not. So again, CO2 is the most essential gas in the atmosphere. We're sitting here at 400 parts per million. The plants are doing fine, but they could do better. That's why farmers put extra CO2 into greenhouses to make sure their plants grow better. During the ice ages, came down to 190 parts per million, and you see how close we were to the death zone for CO2. That's what we want to avoid. So low T CO2 equals plant death, which equals CO2 deserts, which actually happened during the last ice age. We had CO2 deserts. High CO2 equals plant growth equals global greening. It's good for the environment. Here's a quote from a recent paper. So global vegetation models suggest that CO2 fertilization is the main driver of global vegetation greening, while warming is the major cause of greening in boreal and Arctic biomes. So even the warming is good because it's good for plants who are in high latitudes. But the main thing is CO2 fertilization is the main driver of global increase in agricultural productivity. So back to the training program. They show this diagram, and this just shows how this is disinformation. This is pure propaganda. This is not science. So this is insurance losses between 1980 and 2016, and you can see that insurance losses are getting higher and higher. This is insurance losses from natural disasters. And what they're trying to say here is that extra CO2 is leading to more extreme weather. You can see there's more insurance losses. Yeah, nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with weather. It's to do with, yeah, it's hogwash. Absolute hogwash. It's to do with this. This is what the chart is trying to show you. This is a chart of world gross domestic product. As world GDP increases, there is more infrastructure to be affected by natural events. So if we want to get the truth, and everybody knows this, they just won't tell the councillors this, we need to divide by GDP. And if we do that, this was done by Professor Pilkey, we get this. Same graph, just divided by GDP. So, yeah, global weather losses as a percent of global gross domestic product. And as you can see, allowing for GDP increase, extra CO2 is leading to less extreme weather, not more. Total opposite of what they're trying to tell councillors. Untrustworthy. I can't even look at the guy's face anymore. As you know, he used to be the icon of the environment, of the BBC, of, the nation. He was the most trustworthy source. But of course, he's just sold his soul, I don't know, to the alarmists. What was his last caper? Come on. Thank you. Was this one, I don't know if you remember this one, this is where the walruses were throwing themselves off cliffs. Do you remember that one? Yes. And he was making such a fuss about this. And they said, this is from the Independent, walruses, the producers of Our Planet, that was the name of the film, have presented the scene as a painful illustration of the impact of climate change. It has to be CO2. CO2 is all-powerful. According to Attenborough's narration, the walruses were left gathering on a single beach out of desperation because their natural habitat, the sea ice, had moved to the north. Hogwash. Absolute hogwash. At the time, this is from the Siberian Times, the people who might know about this, village was besieged by polar bears as hundreds of terrorized walruses fall to their death. There was a strong suggestion that this was polar bear hunting. It's a great way to get some food, isn't it? You just chase the walruses off a cliff and off they go. But not only that, and Attenborough would have known this. This has been going on for decades. This is from 1996. It was the third consecutive year that walruses plunged to their death on this beach, and scientists still can't explain why. There were many theories. The walruses, the many photographers who were there, who were spooking the walruses. And some people said it was that when they went out to go feeding, as they do every now and then, they all rush off into the sea and go feeding. The ones on the top of the cliffs were just taking the short route down because they're not overly bright, these animals. But anyway, you can see them doing this in 1996 on a video. It's on YouTube. Walruses falling off Alaska cliffs is the name of the video. And note that the walruses were not on ice sheets in 1996, they were on the beach again. Every time I see walruses, they're always on beaches. I don't think they like sitting on ice. It's probably too slippery for them, I don't know. Someone will have to tell me about that. So this is not due to global warming. It's been going on for decades. And dear old Attenborough is not to be trusted, and you can read all about it. Here we go. Fallen Icon, Sir David Attenborough and the Walrus Deception, by Susan Crockford, who's the authority on polar bears. She knows all about it. So do read. And then we come to Shropshire floods. Oh no. This is in the council training, all about Shropshire floods. Shropshire is flooding. The River Severn is flooding. Think of the children. I don't know. But what flood are they talking about? Was it 1338, 1795, 1846, 1848, 1852, 1867, 1941, 1947, 1948, 1950, 2000, 2022, or 2023? Which one really are they talking about? Because the greatest ever flood that we know of, this is in Shrewsbury Town, by the way, is 1795. This is the highest ever recorded, was 1795, and that was a natural event. And then we come to 1946-47, when the Abbey was flooded. That was a natural event. But then we come to year 2000, bam! It's a sure sign of global warming. Absolutely, and we've got the proof. I've got the proof for you. Here it is. There we go. This was a flood that reached the steps of the Abbey. They don't have a cathedral in Shrewsbury, they have an Abbey. So this flooding reached the steps of the Abbey. This is man-made, this is global warming. However, that's just a natural event. That was 1946-47, that one. And I don't know if you can see, but look at the tide line on this one. The tide line is halfway up the church doors. But that's just a natural event. We don't worry about that. So, flooding. Is this CO2 or is it cyclical? So this is from the Environment Agency about the Shrewsbury floods. And they say the time between floods can vary significantly, and an unusually flood-free period during the 70s, 80s and 90s served to mask the ever-present risk. I don't know if you saw it in those flood records, but there was a group in the 40s and 50s of floods, and now there's a group in the 2000s and 2010s of floods. But for the 70s, 80s and 90s, there were precious few floods. So is this linear or is this cyclical? Can we see some sort of cyclical record in this? Well, if it was CO2, this is the CO2 record from Mauna Loa, you'll probably recognise it. The increase in CO2 has been linear. There's no cycles in that data. However, what else could it be? If we're not talking about CO2, perhaps it could be oceanic cycles. And I don't know why people don't know about this, but it's not in the media, basically. How about the AMO, which is the Atlantic Multidecadal Oscillation? And here we have an oscillation. The AMO is changes in the distribution of water in the Atlantic, different temperatures. And this has been tracked all the way back to 1850. So we've got a long record here. And you might recognise some of this cycle because we've got the cold 2010s, the warm 1930s, cold 1970s, warm 2000s. Remember the Dust Bowl America of the 1930s. Remember the 1970s when they were predicting a new ice age. And the 2000s when we've got global boiling, no less. Yeah, it does coincide with what we understand the weather to be doing. And we can actually compare this with the data records. So here's the data records from HADCRUT. Not sure if you're familiar with HADCRUT, but they are the Hadley Climate Research Unit over in East Anglia. recognised authority for climate and temperature. And this is their global 50-year annual trend. So this is a global temperature. But again, we see cold 20s, warm 40s, cold 80s, warm 210s. Familiar pattern? Yeah. Apart from the displacement of 10 years, 1 decade displacement, it's very, very similar to the AMO cycle. So if we're looking for a cycle that might affect floods in the Severn, that gave us floods in the 40s and 50s, but no floods in the 80s and 90s, and floods in the 2000s and 2010s, perhaps we should be looking for the AMO and not CO2. So they have this big computer. It's this enormous great computer down in Exeter, where they spent £100 million on this computer to calculate all of these things. And I've got a picture of it for you. So I've been down there, taken this picture of this enormous great computer so you can see what they're doing. And here are the scientists. And as you can see, they're all sitting here looking at the CO2 knob, which is the smallest knob on the computer. No one's looking at the water vapour, which is the biggest cause of greenhouse warming, of course, is water vapour. And then there's this poor guy in the left-hand side. He's found a knob that changes oceans. And there's someone over here looking at the sun, because maybe the sun has something to do with this as well. But no, the scientists, and you could probably recognise these scientists, here's Michael Mann, they're all looking at the CO2 knob, which is the smallest knob on the whole computer. Yeah. The global climate does not have one control knob. That is a given, and yet that's all you will hear about. So, if you say this in polite society, everyone will say, well, 97% of scientists agree with anthropogenic global warming. Yeah, okay, no they don't. This idea came from this paper by John Cook et al., 2013. So what did they do? They took 12,000 climate papers and surveyed the abstracts, and of those, 66% expressed no opinion, so they threw those out of the window. Of the remainder, 3% of papers with an opinion rejected anthropogenic global warming. Ergo, you might say, 97% of papers with an opinion supported global warming. But that was nonsense, because if you look further into the data, 24% of papers, only 24% of papers supported global warming. And yet I, as a CO2 realist, would be a 24%er, because there has been some warming. We don't quite know what's causing it, and we don't quite know the magnitude, but there has been some warming. So if I was answering truthfully, I would be a 24%er, even as a climate realist and CO2 realist. Further down, we find that only 8% implicitly endorsed anthropogenic global warming, that it is all mankind's fault. And only 0.5% supported the IPCC version of anthropogenic global warming. So it was not 97%, it was only 0.5%, which is rather different. And the problem is that all scientists are paid to agree with anthropogenic global warming, just as Sandi was saying. And he who pays the piper calls the tune. And if you don't go along with that tune, you end up like these scientists and you get dismissed from your job. So there is no freedom of research or publication within the scientific community anymore. Last graph, very quickly, Holocene maximum, just to give you an idea about what the climate has been doing over the last few thousand years. So this is 11,000 years of data taken from the JISP-2 ice core up in Greenland. So they just took a big ice core from the top of Greenland. And this is temperature. over the last 11,000 years, and you can see it's gone up and gone down. It's actually following the obliquity of the Earth, but never mind, we won't bother about that so much. And it ends in 1850, because that's just a limitation of ices. You can't date anything in the last 150 years, so we've got to add on to that recent warming. Here it is. But a lot of that is instrument error. We can talk about that later, so we've got to cut that down a little bit. So there we go. I'll chop that. Did that chop down? Yes, it did. Perhaps you can see that we've got a bit of a similarity here. Modern warm period, medieval warm period, Roman warm period, Minoan warm period. They all look rather similar, and there seems to be a periodicity here. It's all about 1,000 years different. And for the Holocene maximum, here it goes. It was actually much warmer during the Holocene maximum 8,000 to 5,000 years ago. And the Sahara turned green and fertile. It was covered in wildebeest and hippopotami and elephants and God knows what, all across the Sahara in those days. So don't let anyone try and tell you that warmth is bad for the biosphere. So that's the end of my little story here. And that's the end. And the main takeaway is don't panic. The world is not going to end in 7 years, as an uneducated teenager tried to tell us, and it's not going to end in 12 years, as an uneducated member of Congress tried to tell us. So anyway, thank you.